we are essentially making the bet that there's like a very, very tight correlation with like the symmetry of this mathematical object and how good or bad an experience feels. One of the key ideas that I've explored is what's called the Symmetry Theory of Valence, and that is that the one of the mathematical features of the object of experience that matters the most is actually like in what way it expresses symmetries. Um, we are essentially making the bet that there's like a very, very tight correlation with like the symmetry of this mathematical object and how good or bad an experience feels. Um, with like the most straightforward analogy here being um, how to analyze like music, where like if you take a particular like piece of sound, in some sense, you might ask, what kind of like pleasant sensations that piece of sound has, what kind of like unpleasant sensations. And it may sound like very ad hoc, like something you might need kind of like a professional to listen to it. And there might not be kind of like a universal way of assessing this. At the same time, though, there are like ways of quantifying roughly, for example, just how dissonant a piece of sound is. And it's like very intimately related with in what ways the piece fails to repeat or fails to perfectly like tessellate over time. In particular, the presence of what's called beat patterns in the sound is one of the main drivers for like an experience or for a particular piece of sound like actually feeling rough and unpleasant. And you can quantify that. And it doesn't matter, whether the sounds are like high frequency or low frequencies. If you apply an equation to quantify just how much roughness there is in the sound, is going to tell you, like this is unpleasant, maybe in the low frequencies, in the high frequencies, but it's the same characteristic. And in the same way, we think like, okay, there's like some algorithms, especially from a field of analysis that is called spectral graph theory, where you can take a graphical structure and at a glance, essentially tell what are like the symmetries present in it. Like if you were to relabel the nodes, which kinds of relabelings would essentially give you the same graph. Like you're like kind of like making a change that doesn't make a change, a difference that doesn't make a difference. And every time you find like one of these symmetries, we hypothesize, this is one way in which you would be able to read that, hey, like you're actually having like a good time. And it's, there's a very, very deep correspondence with music. Sorry, maybe I'm rambling a little bit. I don't know if I
No,
fully addressed the question.
it's all super interesting stuff. A few questions down, I have planned to talk about symmetry. I think this is one of
Yeah.
the core ideas that I really want to understand, and I want the listeners to try and understand. Physicists are deeply interested in symmetry at a really fundamental level. Now, consciousness and the mathematics behind consciousness seems to be related to symmetry. What do you think is the right way to think about what symmetry actually is? I think there's something here that I'm just not fully grasping. Like what's really important about symmetry here that I'm likely missing?
Yeah. I mean, again, yeah, like symmetry is like a super deep topic. There's people who actually argue that physics is actually the study of symmetry, just because of how influential symmetry has been in shaping how like physicists think about the universe. Um, it's much deeper than, let's say, just something like if you reflect an image, like the image looks the same, right? Like, I guess like what most people think about when they think of symmetry is like, well, is your, do you have like a symmetrical face or like, if you look at yourself in the mirror, like that's a case where like, your image in the mirror looks the same as who you are. And there's like a symmetry there. But that is just like one particular type of symmetry. I actually am having this t-shirt, wearing this t-shirt, which is called the, all of these are
Incredible.
the wallpaper symmetry groups, is all of the ways in which you can tessellate a shape in 2 dimensions to fully cover the plane, right? Like what I mean here is, if you start out with like one of these commas, this tiny shape, and you want to like cover a plane with it, there's only so many ways in which you can do it. You start by, for example, like reflecting the shape or like adding like what's called like a rotational symmetry, where you have like the shape and you're making it so that like there's around a point, let's say, for example, here, Where
I
like
can put these. I can overlay these shapes on the screen so you're not showing off your
awesome.
t-shirt the whole time. It might be a bit easier for everyone. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, they're called like wallpaper symmetry groups, and you can prove mathematically that there's only so many of them. That there's no other way in which you can like tessellate a two-dimensional shape and like fully cover a plane without like any gaps. Um, in 3D, there's like many more of these. They're called space groups. There's like 230 of them, and they show up in crystallography. People who study like minerals, for example, like all of the ways in which molecules may like tessellate in 3 dimensions, and for each of these like symmetries, there corresponds a particular like set of like possible minerals that you may actually like look at in the lab and see these properties. Um, and when you have like a certain type of repetition, there's implicitly ways in which waves can fit an integer number of time in those structures that like really restrict the ways in which they can vibrate. And one of the key things that, for example, like physicists look at when like they analyze an object or a system is like what are like its oscillatory modes, right? Like if you were to perturb it, in what ways it might oscillate. Um, and one very powerful intuition pump here is, I mean, like think about like how when an object vibrates, some of the ways in which you can make it oscillate are much better at essentially storing energy without like risking the object from breaking, right? Like one of
Right.
the key analysis you might do like as an engineer is you look at a building and you look at all of the ways in which it can oscillate, and you make simulations of like if there was an earthquake, there was a bunch of energy of a set of frequencies that you were inputting on the system, in what ways its vibrational modes could essentially interfere with one another, such that you might have like regions in the object where you would have um, very high levels of stress, and like potentially strain, and actually the object might break down. And like to a first approximation, when you have like a very asymmetrical object, there's gonna be like vibrational modes that are gonna cause very high levels of stress in particular regions of that object. Like to a first approximation, more symmetrical objects are much more resistant to vibrations because there isn't kind of like a place where the stress is more likely to accumulate and actually like be a risk factor to break the system. Um, and like this is one generic reason why like okay, like symmetry is kind of like more resilient in nature. But the connection to symmetry and physics, it goes much deeper. Like one very important piece of piece of theoretical work is what's called like Noether's theorem, um, from physics, that it's proved that in a physical system, for any symmetry that you find, and symmetry here is defined as invariance under transformation. Um, I'll pack that in a second. There corresponds a preserved quantity. So, for example, in physics, it is a case that the laws of physics are the same independently of where you are. Right, like there is the same laws of physics here as there are like in Saturn, as there are like in wherever you're recording, and that equivalence unlocks a certain invariance. I believe like preservation of like momentum, I think in this case, um if you makes like something move, if it's moving at a certain speed, it kind of like stop moving because the laws of physics are the same everywhere. It would have to, for it to like just spontaneously slow down, right? Like the laws of physics would have to be somewhat different in other regions. And like the fact that the laws of physics are the same over time, like entails as something like preservation of energy. And so you can actually get like the different invariants in physics just by looking at the ways in which the laws of physics apply uniformly across like space and time or different rotational frames. Um, and what this like preserved quantity is actually like something that we think is like like really profound in like how it may map onto phenomenology. Like the classic example for us here is how, like, if you do like a lot of like embodied, let's say like yoga practices and trying to spread energy in your body with various techniques, or like, yeah, essentially like exciting your body and trying to spread the energy. There's like this notion of like there being like energetic blockages in your body, and the fewer of these blockages there are, like the better you feel. Like if there is like kind of like constrictions or places where like, okay, you're sending a wave of energies, quote unquote, and it bounces off, or like it reflects, or it gets distorted somewhere, that is generally, like something that will correspond to like some like bad sensation or like some suboptimal state of well-being. And yeah, if you think through about, okay, like what is happening here, symmetry is actually very intimately connected, right? Like, because if you think of, let's say, like the surface of your skin, or at least your representation of it, as kind of like a grid, um, if you propagate waves on it, like the only way in which the waves will like travel without distortions is if the grid is actually homogeneous and it's symmetrical. Like if there's like distortions, or the grid is like broken down, the waves at some point will actually be kind of like reflected or refracted or diffracted, or almost kind of like as if you had like a lens, so like some sort of like distortion in that space. Whereas if the grid is actually perfectly uniform, you can send a wave through it without like modifying its shape, or like it actually preserves its shape over distances, precisely because the conditions are exactly the same. You're not changing the conditions, and so you're preserving that symmetry. And so there's actually, yeah, like we hypothesize like a very deep correspondence with, for example, how clear and without dissipating waves of sensation travel in your body, and like how symmetrical like your underlying implementation is. And with a goal ultimately of very high valence experiences, very positive states of consciousness, probably involving like some really kind of like homogenized background of experience. I mean, like like the classic example for us here is the jhanas in meditation, which are these advanced concentration states, um, where, yeah, it feels like your experience is kind of completely uniform, at least like spatially. You become kind of like a very simple field of sensations where waves travel unimpeded. I mean, in fact, in some of like the very advanced kind of like high level versions of, even, for example, the first jhana, which is body bliss, the actual shape of the body becomes um, inaccessible. You actually become kind of like a cocoon of sensations, and the waves travel uniformly, kind of in that cocoon of sensations. And as far as we can tell, like pretty much every kind of very pleasant, euphoric state of consciousness, there's one way of analyzing it where you will see that, hey, like the underlying kind of like graph of sensations has become symmetrical in one way or another. I mean, like if even something
Interesting.
as prosaic as kind of like getting drunk, like there's a sense in which you may be actually kind of like be smoothing out the knots of sensations or the imperfections in your representation of your body, such that like waves of euphoria can actually like travel unimpeded. And yeah, we think this, very, very deep correlation with something like Noether's theorem in physics and this phenomenon.
Incredibly interesting, really well explained. I think you just corrected a thing that I had wrong in my head. So you're saying that positive phenomenology is necessarily symmetrical. I kind of had in my head that maybe that was just an encoding. So the mathematical object was symmetrical, and the brain just, for incidentally, encoded that as positive, where it could have been the other way around. It could have been that asymmetrical mathematical structures that are related to phenomenology were positive. But you're saying it's necessarily symmetrical because of the stability of the information. Is that maybe a simplified model for it, that the structure is a little bit more stable when it's symmetrical, and hence it's more likely that symmetrical structures are persisted and maintained through time and evolutionary? Is that sort of, I know, a really simplified way, but is that sort of a way to think about it?
Yeah, yeah. That's definitely a very powerful way to think about it. It might not be like a complete picture, but because there's the mystery is quite deep, and the rabbit hole goes goes quite deeply. But yeah, like the notion of like stability and the capacity to spread information without distortions. I mean, if you think about like any kind of system in the world that can like self-replicate and survive over time, it's got to have like some mechanisms to be able to send information within itself, right? Like and provide a map of itself that where that information doesn't get like distorted, right? Like as it moves in space. And so you probably do require like some notion of, a homogeneity in the field or symmetry in order to like even just survive, or like in order to be like an embodied organism and exist over time. Um, there's like other ways in which, kind of like the signature of symmetry at a glance in a way like tells you potentially like the health of the organism and like why, okay, like evolution would actually be using kind of the signal of symmetry in order to, uh, yeah, like guide survival. There is this framing also from Mike in an article. I've also discussed this quite a bit, which is like the um, homeostatic, the homeostatic theory of symmetrical valence. So, um, you know, if you kind of have like actually like uh, a quick way of telling whether the object is symmetrical or not, that also tells you like a way in which you can like kind of like assess its health at a glance. I mean, like the simple example here is, um, if you listen to a musical instrument, even just by listening to the sound, you can tell if the musical instrument is like broken or if there's like any problem in it, because you will see essentially some failures in the harmony or like some beat patterns may emerge. Um, if you think of like oh, I forget the name in English, but I guess like in the drum set, this like metallic disc that you may hit. I don't know if I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, like if you hit a metallic disc at a glance, you can tell if the metallic disc is actually a little bit broken, or if it is like twisted, or uh, there's like some kind of like deviation or geometric imperfection in it, because its harmonics are going to sound a little bit misaligned. And you can even actually, I mean, this is some of the work our collaborators in Sweden, they have like a video about like what is it like to be a musical instrument, which precisely deals with this. Is you can even like tell actually like how symmetrical the underlying molecular lattice of the instrument is, just based on its sound. Like for example, if you hammer, one of these metallical discs, and you make like these very tiny imperfections, and then you play it and you look at the spectrum is going to look a little bit more noisy, and the frequencies are just not going to align perfectly as kind of like integer multiples of each other. But then if you heat it up and you let it cool slowly in a process that is called like annealing in metallurgy, that process like actually like realigns the molecular lattice and like symmetrifies it, and makes it kind of like whole again, and allows the waves to propagate effectively without dissipating again. And then you hit and you make a sound. You're actually kind of like gonna be like healing the spectrum, and you can like notice the difference between, a disc that has just been hammered versus a disc that was like hammered and then annealed. You heat up the energy and you let it cool, because it actually literally sounds more harmonious. Like actually like reshaping the molecular lattice into a more symmetrical configuration allows the sound to actually like sound better, as it were. And so if you can imagine, okay, like, our whole nervous system and body and vasculature, um, are constantly, like are vibrating in many different frequencies. If we have like a mechanism, biological mechanism, that detects the way in which like these vibrations are a little bit out of line, this is something that from an evolutionary perspective, it would make sense that is like something we would care about, right? Because it's a way to detect at a glance if there is like some damage, without having to actually localize where that damage is, like right away. Like you just, it's kind of like a checksum. It's like it tells you, okay, there's like a problem here. Then of course you need like some mechanism to find like, okay, like what the problem is. But it's something that like allows you to detect if there's like a drop in health. Like it is like just a very, very quick way of doing this, which is, yeah, another reason for it to be like evolutionarily significant.
Yeah, very, very cool. So am I right in saying that these symmetries exist both in nature, the environment, and within our brain and body. So evolutionarily, I like Mark Solms's words on this. Consciousness is an evolved mechanism that evolved so that we can feel our way through a hard problem. That is, that's sort of along your homeostatic valence theory idea. So in this sense, feeling our way through a hard problem is seeking out symmetries in the environment, which we are sort of using as a heuristic to be positive and good for our survival. Then those symmetries, environmental stimulus, are encoded in the brain and also represented in a deep level in the brain. So the symmetry exists in the environment. We're picking it up in that way. And maybe in some way we're not fully understanding. We are getting that symmetrical property from the environment. And then that is also represented in the brain in some way. And I want to get to how exactly that's represented in the brain in a sec. But is that roughly true? So symmetries are both out there and in here.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, like one way of yeah, like I mean, like another lens here really is like trying to spread out the stress in a homogeneous way, in as homogeneous way as possible, and like prevent the build of stress in like localized regions, because that it's essentially like a risk factor for the system like breaking in one way or another. Now, you may actually kind of like think about in what way is kind of like a stress minimization algorithm possibly helpful for like an organism when it comes to like navigating the world, right? Like, I mean, the organism in and of itself will be like trying to do like some stress minimization, because if it doesn't, it's going to accumulate tear and wear and like, die much more quickly. But then a question is like, okay, how do you use, that pursuit for distributing stress and, symmetrifying the organism in order to create like an accurate model of the world, right? Like, because there would be like the temptation, for example, of just hallucinating, like a very symmetrical world around you with a lot of regularities. But if you do that, you may bump into like a needle and, be like cut yourself, or I guess if you're like a tiny, you know, unicellular organism, like you might encounter a very sharp object and you may die as a consequence, right? You may be punctured. So you want to actually balance the pursuit of kind of like the internal harmony, the distribution of stress in a homogeneous way, together with like representational accuracy, or like to actually be able to like navigate the world and the asymmetries in the world and respond to it. Um, but you have to do it in a way that like still in some sense like it's locally driven by the code of like trying to minimize stress or like trying to maximize symmetry. And I think like the most straightforward way in which I can explain like, how an organism ultimately manages to do this is that there's effectively like two places where the organism is trying to quote unquote like minimize uneven stress or like maximize what we might call a phase alignment, or like the ability for like oscillators to essentially be in phase with one another. Like if I mean a straightforward metaphor here is like, when there's like a fire and you have like a line of people that are helping putting it out with buckets of water, where like you're kind of like passing buckets of water from left to right. And if you're not coordinated, right, like you may drop the water, right? Like, or the person right next to you may not catch it, when you pass it on. And there's kind of like a lot of like water dropped along the way. Whereas like a good configuration is what, okay, everybody's actually like in phase with one another. You're precisely there when you're receiving the water. You're ready to get it when you actually get it, and the other is ready to receive it. Likewise, kind of like the most healthy configuration in the body is when the oscillators are like organized in such a way that, okay, there's like a wave of energy coming and you're like ready to receive it and pass it on, as opposed to, like a little bit misaligned and you get it a little bit later, a little bit too early, which causes a spike of stress. And like that may, it's a risk factor for the organism to age and ultimately like hurt itself. And so like even just from this, like just trying to have like in phase interactions, you can think of the organism as having like two key regions. It has the inside, kind of like all of the internal homeostatic processes, but it also has like interactions at the surface, like in what way is receiving sensory input. And so overall, if the organism wants to minimize its stress, it needs to do two things. It needs to like have like this internal phase alignment, but also an alignment with its environment, right? Like that it can anticipate what the environment is going to do to it and prepare for it, right? So you're actually kind of like trying to minimize the stress and the imperfections or the asymmetries, both at the surface of the organism as well as in its interior. And in our framework, like the reason why this actually can really work as like an embodied organism that can survive and replicate over time is that this actually has like a very very deep correspondence with like principles in machine learning, because um, trying to minimize like the prediction error at the surface, like trying to understand to the world, is in some sense like minimizing prediction error, whereas minimizing internal um, phase misalignments is one way in which you also prevent the buildup of like very complex models. So, right, like you want to also like regularize the model, as they say, prevent like overfitting, right? Like, because if you're just trying to maximize, like minimize prediction error, and that's the only thing that you care about, you may internally actually become like way too complex. And if you become too complex internally, then the stresses are going to accumulate inside, right? Like you have to balance the simplicity of your model in order to not actually break internally, and the accuracy of your model, which is essentially evaluated at the surface. Like how well the retina is actually like receiving what your brain is expecting that it's going to receive.
Yes.
And in this way, you kind of get something actually from the literature, would be the free energy principle, which essentially is it is the balancing between minimizing prediction error while also preventing the buildup of like model complexity. And all of this, we would argue, just comes out straightforwardly out of like maximizing symmetry in systems of coupled oscillators.
Super. And you keep predicting my questions. So I was I was exactly going to bring up, how does this theory fit into a predictive processing, Carl Friston, free energy principle sort of framework for the brain? Are they at odds with each other? Because a lot of the words you're saying and even the sentences sound very similar, and they seem like you're doing this minimization of of models. Where do they run into each other at any point? Are they cohesive? Do you see that these are two frameworks that really could be built together into something that is more unified, and kind of explain how we might fit them together?
Yeah. Effectively, like we consider Friston's free energy principle and predictive processing to be one of our lineages. Like if you go to qri.org, one of the the tabs is academic lineages that like feed into our research. And there's like, I think like 10 of them that we name explicitly. There's a few that we don't name, but we do hint at them. But yeah, one of the very explicit ones is free energy from Friston. And effectively, we think that it's a very powerful conceptual tool to like analyze the systems and make sense of them. Um, but it is incomplete, right? Like, because something like the free energy principle doesn't give you, in particular, like phenomenal binding. It doesn't give you like a mechanism by which different pieces of information like will come together into a unified moment of experience, right? Like that piece is just not present in that theory. In fact, if you like ask Carl Friston, like, okay, like what is consciousness? He will start out by saying, well, consciousness is first and foremost like a process of inference, right? Is not a thing. It's a process, and in fact, it's a probabilistic process of inference. So it's a very very narrow kind of like conception of it. Rather, we flip it around. I mean, like in the QRI world, consciousness is a real thing. In fact, actually, you might be able to identify it with a four-dimensional pocket of the electromagnetic field in one of the models that we play with. However, it is a certain type of object that has been selected by natural selection to essentially like minimize free energy. Like it has this quality that it can be recruited uh, for a process of inference that will minimize prediction error while also minimizing the internal model complexity. That said, like if you just think of an object as having, a free energy minimization quality, even if it's very sophisticated and computational, at least in the QRI world, we don't predict that, that alone will make it conscious in any way. Like you still require something else to actually make it a unified moment of experience. And in that sense, yeah, there's like very clearly a divergence. And then yeah, the other thing too is that uh, like so there's this thing called Mars levels of analysis, which is like a way of analyzing information processing systems that we think is actually quite conceptually clarifying and quite helpful. And it goes as follows. So any system, you can analyze it from kind of like three perspectives. I would say the first one is, what does the system do? What is kind of its input output mapping? How does it behave under different circumstances? And this is the computational level of analysis. Like what is it like doing some kind of like probabilistic inference and so on. You're describing kind of like what it's doing. The second level of analysis, it's what's called the algorithmic level of analysis, which is concerned with like in what ways the system is creating internal representations or memory caches, and in what way it's connecting them in order to process the information to accomplish what you see in the computational level, in the level of like what it does. And then there's like a deeper level, which is the implementation level, which is like, okay, like physically, how is the system actually put together so that it can instantiate this particular algorithm? Now, the free energy, principle ultimately applies to the first level, right? Like it's a way of describing a system in terms of like what it is doing, what is it accomplishing, what kind of information is it processing, but it is actually like silent ultimately about like how it is doing it at an algorithmic level, and definitely ultimately like how it is implemented physically. And the truth is like you can have like many systems that you can all of them describe them effectively with something like a free energy minimization framework, and yet like the essence of the way in how they're constructed might actually be very, very different and utilizing very different algorithmic ideas or like physical principles. um and so from our perspective, like the free energy principle is not really a theory of consciousness, but it's more kind of a constraint on theories of consciousness, right? It's like one of the things that a theory of consciousness must be able to satisfy is that it has to like fit into this framework for like how an organism can repel entropy and survive in a very hot universe. um, but it's not actually like a model of consciousness in and of itself, because if that was the case, yeah, we would be predicting that a huge number of other systems are conscious, which yeah, we suspect are not.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel